Hey everyone, this past week we covered the ending of Jesus's roughly 3-month tour in Gentile country. And we learned how it must have been so perplexing to the apostles when Jesus starts to go north up to Tyre and Sidon and perform all the mighty miracles that he did. But it culminates with the feeding of the 4,000. And it's interesting. We learn some amazing lessons in these 10 verses, the first 10 verses of chapter 8, that Jesus is using as a moment to give the apostles and consequently us an amazing look into Jesus's provision. And one thing we want to be aware of is, are we aware of Jesus's provision in our life? You know, the meaning of provision is the action of providing and supplying. And so many times the provision that Jesus gives is so misunderstood. And in this 4,000, Jesus comes right out and says that he has compassion on them. And we got to understand, the reason he has compassion on them is not just because they're hungry. It's because they've been with him 3 days and they are hungry. And it's amazing. We learned the Greek of that, having been with him, is to remain steadfastly and faithfully, to live out their faith. And really the Greek implies, and while we're not certain, the Greek implies that these people are living out the ingredients of a saving faith with Jesus. And he has such compassion on them. So he goes to the disciples, and it's a very familiar story when he fed the 5,000 back in Galilee. And he provides. He literally provides somethingness out of nothingness, and he gives it to the disciples to distribute out to the crowd. And it's incredible how Jesus is teaching his apostles. He knows that the cross is less than a year away by now, and he knows that he wants them to understand what the true provision is in life. And what Jesus starts to talk about is he is the bread of life. And I love John chapter 6, where Jesus explains this in detail. He says, "I am the bread of life," and he goes back to the words of Deuteronomy with the Jewish nation when they were in exile, and how God rained down manna. That was like a bread wafer. That was their main staple for 40 years when they were in the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And Jesus draws back to that, and he says in John chapter 6, they ate the manna and they died. But I'm the bread of life, that when you take this bread, you'll never die. And it was a perplexing saying to those, especially the Pharisees in the day, because they literally thought Jesus was referring to cannibalism. And what Jesus is talking about is the cross. And so the ultimate provision that Jesus did, this feeding of the 4,000, the fact that he was able to create something that's out of nothingness, shows us that he's God. He is 100% sovereign. He can do whatever he wants. But the fact that he distributes bread is a beautiful foreshadowing of his suffering at the cross of Calvary. And that's the ultimate provision, the ultimate act of God. We learn in the scriptures is that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. But there's something else interesting in this. If you'll notice, Jesus gives the bread to the apostles to distribute to the crowd. He didn't just give it straight to the crowd. And that's a beautiful picture of what God wants for his church. You see, we say it often here at Hendersonville Church. The church, the capital C church, it's God's plan A. And there is no plan B. And so God wants to comfort us with the provision through his word and through Christ, so that we take that comfort we've gotten from God through our abiding and through reading his beautiful scriptures, so that we can then visit others in their affliction, and we can comfort them with the comfort we've received from Christ. And that's the ultimate provision. And it's amazing because Paul, he's writing these letters to the church of several years after Mark, after the account of Jesus feeding the 4,000 that Mark has written about. And he's talking to the church in Corinth, and he says something that helps us understand what true provision is from Christ. And again, it's to supply a need, or to provide in a time of need. And basically what Paul's saying is I had this thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. And he says 3 times I pleaded, I begged the Lord to take it from me. And Jesus gives him an answer that really helps us understand this comfort. He says, my grace is sufficient for you. And it begs a question because Paul goes on, he says, I'm not only do I accept my weakness, he says, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, for I know that when I am weak, I am strong, because Christ's power is shown in our weakness. And when we suffer in the suffering of the trials of life, that God ordains for us to walk through for his glory, he's doing something huge in our lives. So many times we take that if God hasn't answered a prayer, that it's because his favor's not on us, or because he doesn't love us. And granted, there are times if we're disobedient that there are consequences for that. But many times he's doing a new work. He is up to something to show us and to use our story to encourage other people and to draw them into a relationship. And so throughout these coming weeks, ask yourself, am I aware of Jesus's provision, knowing that it comes through his word, through his spirit that is indwelt within us if we are indeed his kids? And if you don't feel that provision, listen, talk to somebody about that. Work that out. If you feel nothing coming from Jesus, like when Paul says he pleaded, and he says, I boast in my weaknesses, Paul embraced that. He knew Jesus' provision for him. And it's incredible how Jesus desires to use his church, his bride, to help comfort those, and he uses us in the act of his provision, just like he did with the apostles. Are you allowing yourself to be used? Because through that's additional provision we receive from Christ. Talk that over and work that out. If you got any questions, reach out to someone and ask about that. Take care.